Look around these halls, stranger. Take in these vases, these tapestries, these creaking statues and broken mosaics. They all have stories, these things. Stories that I shall relate to you. I'll be as truthful as I can, though sometimes my memory slips, and some of the stories passed down to me have become confused in repetition or embellished by poets, or were never true to begin with. And besides, some of the things I shall tell you, they're so astonishing you may not believe them anyway. Many cities will fall in this story. Few will be as magnificent as Babylon, once the largest city in the world. A city where gardens grew from rooftops, nourished by the sparkling Euphrates, which flowed right through Babylon's heart. A city ringed by lapis blue walls and gates that bore the names of gods. Darius, newly crowned king of the Persians, was not here to admire the sights. The Babylonians rejected the rule of Darius, and so he responded as Persian kings do, with thunderous wrath. From their vast realm, the Persians brought forth every tool of destruction they could muster. Looming siege towers, battering rams with heads of iron, arrows wrapped in burning flax. To Babylon, the Persians brought death. You may have the impression that Darius was nothing but a violent conqueror. And indeed, he crushed all who opposed him with brutal force. But he was also an admirable administrator. Once the slaughter was over, he divided his empire into provinces known as satrapies, to be governed by trusted men. On the western edge of the empire lay the satrapy of Lydia, which Darius gave to his half-brother, Artaphernes. A remote posting, though not an unpleasant one. Lydia was a wealthy land of fine horses, gold-bearing rivers, and wine to rival any Mediterranean vintage. Along Lydia's western coast was a region called Ionia, and here dwelt Greeks, who many centuries ago had planted colonies along the Ionian shore. These Greeks rarely caused trouble for their Persian masters, and so long as they paid their tribute on time, the Persians were happy to leave their foreign subjects to their own devices. Enter Aristagoras, ruler of the Greek city of Miletus, a man whose ambitions regularly outstripped his capacities. His head filled with imagined glories, Aristagoras went to the court of the satrap Artaphernes and proposed a scheme to his master. If the Persians would provide Aristagoras with a fleet, he would conquer the island of Naxos for the great king. Artaphernes was intrigued. Naxos was a gem that would surely please his half-brother the king. And so Artaphernes summoned all that the expedition might require: shipwrights and steersmen, baggage handlers and quartermasters, cedar wood for triremes and cornel wood for spears, plump goats for eating, and white lambs for sacrifice. A glorious conquest seemed sure to follow. Having squandered the great king's fleet, Aristagoras rightly feared for his head and most of his other body parts. But fear can make men do unexpected things. Rather than flee, Aristagoras launched a rebellion. Aristagoras knew that he'd need all the men he could muster. He sailed to Greece with a bronze map that showed the rich Persian realm, hoping to tempt would-be fortune-seekers from their rocky homeland. The cautious Spartans refused to get involved, but the Athenians, who were fond both of great adventures and reckless decisions, were easily persuaded. Returning with these Athenian treasure hunters, Aristagoras marched across Ionia, rallying cities to his cause and deposing any rulers who remained loyal to the Persians. Now, there are some who think that Aristagoras was a true freedom fighter, committed to Greek liberty. Others say he acted out of desperation or embarrassment. Others think he wanted only greater power for himself. Whatever the truth may be, Artaphernes' once peaceful satrapy was now the site of a major rebellion led by a man with nothing left to lose. The army of Aristagoras, a rowdy band of desperate rebels, committed freedom fighters and avaricious fortune seekers, now made its boldest move yet. They descended upon Sardis, the mighty capital of Lydia itself, where Artaphernes governed in luxury. Like wolves ravaging a flock of lambs, the Greeks swarmed through the streets, overwhelming the unprepared garrison. Artaphernes watched on in horror. How had Aristagoras, who couldn't take tiny Naxos even with a Persian armada on his side, swept into Sardis uncontested? In what seemed like mere moments, the Greeks had seized the whole of Sardis, all except the Acropolis, where Artaphernes prepared to make his stand. Fire is sacred to the Persians. In fire they see the light and truth of their supreme god, Ahura Mazda. So imagine their horror as they watched the holy shrines of Sardis go up in flames. Imagine their fear as they fought the pitiless blaze. Imagine their anger as Aristagoras fled the city with his Greek marauders. Whether it was arson or accident, the burning of Sardis would spark untold horrors for both the Greeks and Persians. Invasions, massacres, slaughters, sieges. All these things I will relate to you in good time. Artaphernes had no notion of what great and terrible events were to come. He was focused purely on bringing the treacherous Aristagoras to justice. His face still blackened with ash, Artaphernes gathered his swiftest riders and rode out after the rebels at a furious gallop. Like a boxer sent reeling by an unexpected blow, who then turns on his foe with renewed fury, Artaphernes landed his first counterblow to the rebellion at Ephesus. The Persians fully expected this uprising to shatter at the first sign of adversity. And yet the Greeks continued to resist. Artaphernes knew what had to be done. He directed the full might of Persia against Miletus, home city of Aristagoras and epicenter of the rebellion. This was no small undertaking. Miletus was a mighty metropolis, famed for its wealth. From its bustling harbour, Miletus had seeded the shores of the Black Sea with dozens of colonies. Now that harbour hosted the entire Ionian navy, its triremes bristling with fierce Greek marines. A formidable target. But Artaphernes was well acquainted with the endless squabbles of his former subjects, and knew that with a single loose thread, he could unravel the entire Greek alliance. Artaphernes soon found just such a thread. The Greek sailors were on the verge of mutiny, having been driven to exhaustion by the endless drills of their relentless admiral, Dionysius. Artaphernes had found the soft underbelly of Miletus. Now, he made ready to slit it open. With the capture of Miletus, the Greek rebellion shattered. The burning of Sardis still fresh in their minds, the Persians brutally stamped out the last isolated remnants of the uprising. taking cleansing fire to cities, fields, and sanctuaries. Ash and blackened bones were the only remaining testaments to the hubris of Aristagoras. For most men, this would have been vengeance enough. But for the great king of Persia, retribution had to be absolute. If a single rebel was seen to escape punishment, then Darius would soon be dealing with recalcitrant Bactrians, or the arrogant Babylonians again, or the Egyptians, for whom peace was simply an interlude between uprisings. No, there was still one enemy unpunished. Men who had sailed all the way across the Aegean just to pillage the great king's realm. 3 times each night at dinner, Darius had a servant whisper in his ear, "Master, remember the Athenians." So the great king ordered the construction of a mighty fleet and entrusted it to his most dependable commander, Datis. At the first fluttering of the Etesian winds, Datis launched his deep-bellied warships into the Aegean, their prows pointed for Greece. In those days, most fleets would travel along the coastline, returning to shore each night. But Datis had a different plan. He would cut a bloody swathe straight through the islands of the Aegean, starting with Naxos, where, all those years ago, the failure of Aristagoras had birthed such troubles for the Greeks. Such was the fury of the Persians. Such was the vengeance they exacted on traitors, oath-breakers, and temple burners. And though the Athenians had sent only 20 ships to aid the Ionians, they too would face the great king's wrath. Panic spread throughout Athens. At this time, the city was far from the grand metropolis it would later become. It had no navy, no empire, no Parthenon. Even its democracy was barely 2 decades old. Yet now, like a storm-tossed fishing boat facing a towering wave, little Athens was on the brink of being engulfed. Like good Democrats, the Athenians elected their generals, 10 each year, and it was these men who now debated what to do. Among these generals was Aristides. Aristides the Just, they called him. As upright a man as you'll ever meet, his commitment to his city faultless. And then there was Themistocles, his lifelong rival. Themistocles was an outsider from an obscure family. He was a radical, audacious in thinking, and he was a schemer who never put justice ahead of expediency. But in this desperate hour, these ambitious men agreed that the bold Miltiades should take supreme command. Miltiades ordered the Athenians to muster at the plain of Marathon, there to await the Persians. There was little time left to prepare. Across the Euboean Gulf, the Athenians watched the Persians burn Eretria and knew they were next. Marathon was a stunning victory. Those who fought there became known as the Marathonomachoi. Among them, the great tragedian Aeschylus, whose tombstone never bothers to mention his dramas, only his glorious involvement at Marathon. With the enemy vanquished, the Athenians slept soundly. All except Themistocles, who yearned for the glory that went to Miltiades. Not that Miltiades remained a hero very long. The next year he made a dreadful mess of an expedition to Paros, was promptly thrown in prison by the angry Athenians, and died shortly thereafter from a gangrenous leg wound. Great men, you see, rarely meet great ends. Lack of recognition wasn't the only thing that kept Themistocles awake at night. He knew that the Persians would soon return, and Athens was utterly unprepared. So when the Athenians struck a rich vein of silver, Themistocles proposed something radical. They should spend it on a fleet of warships, and transformed their unremarkable city into a naval power. His rival Aristides disagreed, as you might expect. The Persian threat was gone, he argued, and fleets of squalid things rowed by squalid men. The Athenians had a wonderfully efficient way to resolve disputes like these: an ostracism. Unlike regular elections, where the Athenians voted eagerly for whoever made them the most extravagant promises, in an ostracism, the citizens voted to expel whichever politician they found most disagreeable. This was Themistocles' opportunity. If he could get his stubborn rival Aristides ostracized, he could have his fleet and his chance at glory. Just as Themistocles predicted, the Persians were readying another invasion. King Darius had died, but his son Xerxes was no less warlike. Indeed, he sought not just to punish Athens, but to conquer the whole of Greece. This new great king summoned all the forces of the vast Persian realm: axe-wielding Sakai, Syrians with helmets of twisted bronze, Ethiopians draped in leopard skins and armed with palmwood bows. At the Hellespont, they gathered in their thousands. A host so enormous it drank rivers dry. The great king ordered a bridge of boats constructed between Europe and Asia. The two continents yoked together like ill-matched oxen. Xerxes would force the sea itself to bend to his will. The Greeks called an urgent council. Many cities had already submitted to Xerxes, offering the earth and water he demanded. But other cities resolved to fight. They pledged to unite their forces and cease their feuds with one another. A most extraordinary thing for Greeks to do, you understand. Together, the allied Greek cities devised a plan. King Leonidas of Sparta would march to the mountain pass of Thermopylae, there to await the Persian army. Meanwhile, Themistocles and the Greek fleet would make their stand at the Strait of Artemisium. With the narrow terrain on their side, and desperation coursing through their veins, the Greeks hoped to halt the Persian flood, or dam it, long enough to buy time. With their city now completely exposed to the Persian invaders, the desperate Athenians turned to the god Apollo for advice. At Delphi, Apollo's priestess, always a wise, graceful woman, would give voice to the god's prophecies in cryptic riddles. On this occasion, her advice to the Athenians was unusually clear and utterly terrifying. Flee, she told them. Flee to the ends of the earth. The Athenians begged for a second audience. Apollo, apparently forgiving this impertinence, now offered one ray of hope. Whatever else may occur, intoned his priestess, the wooden wall would remain intact. This was very encouraging, until the Athenians realized that they had no idea what the wooden wall was supposed to be. Some argued that it meant the palisade around the Acropolis, and wanted to make their stand there, but Themistocles persuaded the Athenians otherwise. The wooden wall, he said, meant the fleet. And so the people of Athens extinguished their hearths, left behind the tombs of their ancestors, and trudged down to the harbour at Piraeus, there to board the fleet with all they could carry. After ferrying the women and children across the Saronic Gulf, the fleet moored in the Bay of Salamis with the rest of the Greek allies. There, they watched with anguish as the Persians marched into Athens and torched their undefended homes. Like bulls who reach the sacrificial altar and spook at the baying crowd below, the allies began to panic. Many wished to flee. But there was to be no escape. the Persians blockaded both exits from the Straits of Salamis, trapping the Greek fleet. There are some who say that it was the scheming Themistocles himself who tipped off the great king, forcing his allies to stand alongside him. I know not whether this is true, but I do know that Themistocles would do anything for his people. Now, trapped in the Straits of Salamis, the Greeks had only two options: victory or death. Like a hunter who at last looms over a cornered boar, only for the desperate beast to turn and gore him, Xerxes was stunned by the Greek victory. Themistocles seized this advantage. He tricked the great king once again, sending word that the Greeks would sail to the Hellespont and destroy the Persians' bridge back to Asia. Having seen quite enough of Greece already, Xerxes fled as fast as his palanquin bearers could carry him. The Greeks, who usually loved nothing more than fighting each other, had seen what could be achieved through unity. Headed by Pausanias, regent king of Sparta, they formed a grand alliance. Its goal was not simply to defend Greece, but to carry the war across the Aegean into the great king's domain. Their first target was an audacious one: Cyprus, deep within Persian waters. Only the Phoenicians and Egyptians supplied more ships to Xerxes than the many kingdoms of Cyprus. And so a Greek armada sailed eastwards, the likes of which none had seen since the days of Agamemnon. An endless tapestry of sails, bearing the proud symbols of cities large and small. Across the wine-dark sea they came, heading straight for the heart of the Persian realm. The Greeks were in high spirits. How could they not be, after the miraculous victory at Salamis, and then the daring strike against Cyprus? And so for their next target, they chose Byzantium. No mere city, but a gateway between continents. Its harbors crowded with merchants from 100 different lands. But trouble loomed over the Greek fleet. The Spartan leader Pausanias began to treat the allies as a despot treats his slaves, using threats in place of persuasion, issuing demands rather than seeking counsel. The allies, enraged by the arrogance of Pausanias, whispered their protest to that most incorruptible of statesmen, the Athenian Aristides. And Aristides, whether irked by injustice or sensing an opportunity for Athens, or perhaps imbibing some of Themistocles' talent for scheming, began to wonder whether Athens, not Sparta, should lead the Greek alliance. Accusations rose against Pausanias until Sparta finally recalled him, and into the waiting arms of Athens the allies willingly came. The Athenians formed a new alliance, the Delian League. Each year, its members would send Athens either money or ships for the common defense. Most chose coin, and so from many small streams, a torrent of wealth began to flow into Athens. Athenian power now surpassed even Themistocles' most ambitious dreams. From a hastily assembled fleet to mastery of a mighty league. You might imagine that Themistocles would be terrifically popular after all of this. But that's not how things work in Athens. His jealous rivals stood by, plotting his fall. And as the years went on, Athens too incurred the suspicion of her allies. With the Persian threat repelled, they asked, why should they continue to pay their tribute to Athens? The winds of the Aegean were thick with discontent. And so the Delian League became the Athenian Empire. And Themistocles, like all who become great in Athens, suffered his fall. Exiled from his home by jealous rivals, he ended up volunteering his services to none other than the great king of Persia, who reasoned that the Persians' greatest foe might prove their most useful servant. So Themistocles ended his days a loyal subject of the Mede. As I said, great men rarely meet great ends. Decades passed. The Athenian Empire grew to new heights under the wise statesman Pericles, who governed with his beloved Aspasia at his side. Athens, burnt to a husk mere decades earlier, was now a marvelous metropolis, resplendent in glittering marble, prosperous and confident. The city of Athena nurtured a golden age of art, philosophy, and architecture. But the days when Athens fought side by side with Sparta were long gone. Greece fractured into two great powers, the Athenian Empire and the Peloponnesian League, circling each other like yellow-eyed wolves. One hardly needed the foresight of Apollo to see that war was coming. On land, none could resist the Spartans, whose men devoted their whole lives to war. At sea, the Athenian fleet was unmatched, and with Athens connected to its port by a set of long walls, the navy could feed the city indefinitely, should any foe attempt a siege. All Greece held its breath, like an audience that awaits the arrival of a tragic chorus, knowing that things both great and terrible are about to unfold. The plague killed Pericles, and with him Athens' steady hand. Perhaps Pericles was fortunate in a way. He died at the height of his fame, before he could suffer the inevitable downfall of great men in Athens. But enough of Athens. Let me tell you of the Peloponnese, homeland of the Spartans, where jagged mountains loom over plains riven by earthquakes. All along its rugged coastline came Athenian raiders. Triremes drove their bronze-clad prows onto Peloponnesian shores, vengeful hoplites swarming out like hornets. For the most part, the Spartans were unsuited to deal with these raids. They've always been a slow, ponderous people. The dashing general Brasidas, however, was no typical Spartan. Energetic, gregarious, eloquent, sharp in thought and quick in action. When Athenian raiders came to Methone, the town cried out for just such a savior. If only Brasidas could make it in time. The Spartans hailed Brasidas as a hero. In the early days of the war, when their futile occupation of Attica dragged on and the expected victory never came, Brasidas was a rare figure of inspiration, the protector of Spartan honor against vicious Athenian pirates. But the Athenian raids endangered more than Sparta's honor. Turmoil in the Peloponnese threatened the very foundations of Spartan society. Centuries earlier, you see, the Spartans had marched across the mountains into Messenia, conquered its entire people, and forced them into perpetual serfdom. Hereafter, the Messenians were called Helots and toiled year-round for their Spartan masters. The Spartans were utterly dependent on these Helots, as dependent as they were fearful, for they knew that given the slightest chance, the Helots would gladly eat their masters alive. Like a field of dry heather, the Peloponnese would need only a tiny spark to burst into flames. And the Athenian raiders knew it. Brasidas donned his helmet, its horsehair crest swaying in the salty breeze, and marched down to the coast. The Spartans fought off raid after raid, but they knew that the black-bellied ships would keep coming, unless they could force the Athenians to direct their attention elsewhere. An opportunity soon presented itself, courtesy of a suggestion from the wily Macedonian king, Perdiccas. He brought word that many of Athens' allies in the far north were wavering in their commitment. Ripe fruit, perhaps, to be plucked from the enemy alliance. Quite the trek for most Spartans, who spend as little time away from their homeland as possible. But Brasidas was not like most Spartans. He gathered an army, its strength bolstered by thousands of helots, to whom he promised freedom in exchange for brave service. Northwards they marched, the red-cloaked Spartans at their head, ready to plunge their spears into the Athenian Empire's naked flank. Brasidas lived just long enough to hear that he was victorious. This, for the Greeks, is the perfect way to die, expiring at the very height of one's glory. Some say that there was something in Brasidas that sought death, that yearned for it. Not for him a quiet senescence tending his vines. He would die with Ares watching. The Greeks are always at war with each other, but they usually resolve things quickly. They find a suitable plain, line up opposite each other, and settle their disagreement in a single brutal clash. But this new, interminable kind of war was exhausting. And with the deaths of Brasidas and Cleon, both Sparta and Athens had lost their most energetic leaders. So they took to diplomacy and signed a peace treaty that was to last for 50 years. They were fighting again within a decade. And the Athenians, always quick to make terrible decisions, resolved that the surest path to victory was to open up an entirely unnecessary new front, in Sicily of all places. The Athenians tried to enclose the Sicilian capital of Syracuse within a vast stone wall. To stop this, the Syracusans tried to intercept them with a counterwall of their own. This is about the height of Greek siegecraft, I'm afraid. After months of this walling and counter-walling, the Syracusans' resolve began to waver. But just in time, reinforcements arrived from Sparta. The Sicilian expedition was planned hastily, executed incompetently, and concluded horrifically. The Athenians were chased from Syracuse all the way to the river Asinarus, where they were speared like writhing tuna in the blood-churned water. This defeat should have spelled the end of the Athenian Empire. But like the many-headed Hydra, Athens recovered from every wound. For as long as they could hide behind their walls, supplied from the sea, the Athenians would never surrender. Lysander knew this. When Sparta made him admiral of a fleet that didn't yet exist, well, it seemed like the latest insult in a lifetime of derision. But Lysander was determined. He knew that Sparta needed a navy, and that required money. Real money. Not the iron spits that the austere Spartans used as currency. So Lysander sailed to Ionia to meet with the young Persian prince, Cyrus. He struck a deal with the old enemy, Persian gold for a Spartan fleet, and the troublesome Athenian navy reduced to splinters. Like a razor-beaked hawk swooping down on a crowd of startled jackdaws, Lysander shattered the unsuspecting Athenian fleet. At long last, the navy that shielded Athens from the horrors of siege was vanquished. Lysander bore down on Athens, determined to have his victory, but not before driving every Athenian garrison out of Asia Minor, so that their city would be packed with hungry mouths. No fleet, no hesitancy, no law, human or divine, stood between Lysander and the triumph he sought. Proud Athens, which had once gorged itself on the fruits of its empire, now starved. Sallow-faced and trembling, the Athenians begged Lysander to lift his siege. To make sure that Athens would always remain at his mercy, Lysander tore down the long walls to the mocking music of flute girls. Lysander finally had his victory, and he made sure it was never forgotten. At Delphi, the center of the Greek world, he had himself sculpted in bronze. But, as you must have learnt by now, great men rarely meet great ends. And before long, Lysander was dead, his legacy scorned by the kings he served, his memory blackened with accusations of arrogance, violence, and greed. You might think that after spending nearly 3 decades at war, the Greeks would settle down, at least for a little while. Alas, they were at each other's throats again soon enough. Endless configurations of cities in alliances and leagues and empires, fighting for gold or territory or honor, or sometimes for no good reason at all. No. The Greeks would never stand together by choice, only by necessity or compulsion. And indeed, the day would soon come when unity would be forced upon them by a man whose cunning eclipsed Themistocles, whose swiftness was greater than Brasidas, whose ruthlessness was beyond even Lysander, and whose ambitions were a match for any king who ever lived. But I grow weary now. Return on the morrow, and I shall continue our tale. I thought you might return. Now, where were we? I told you about the folly of Aristagoras and the great king's wrath. There was Themistocles, the defense of Greece, and the rise of Athens. Ah yes, Brasidas and Lysander, and the great war that tore Greece apart. My, we really did cover quite a lot. Perhaps this time I'll stick to a single subject. While the Greeks squabbled endlessly, to their north there lay the entirely unremarkable kingdom of Macedon, a poor, rugged land, its borders beset by belligerent neighbors and driven from within by feuding nobles. For centuries, the kings of Macedon had done all they could just to hold this fragile fiefdom together. Glorious expansion was out of the question. All this changed when Philip took the throne. His was an improbable kingship. The crown only passed to Philip after both of his older brothers had their turns on the throne cut short. One slain in battle, and the other by an assassin's blade. Determined not to meet the same fate, Philip immediately set to reforming the Macedonian military, arming his soldiers with pikes as long as 4 men laid head to toe. As for those troublesome nobles, the prospect of prize commands in Philip's new army provided a tempting incentive to good behavior. When Philip marched against the Scythians, his eyes set on yet more plunder to feed his growing realm, there was a new commander among his forces, his teenage heir, Alexander. A boy of little experience, but tremendous ambitions. Philip was about to give his son a first, alluring taste of glory. Alexander had certainly enjoyed an upbringing to match his grandiose ambitions. His tutor had been none other than the great philosopher, Aristotle. Aristotle taught him political theory, ethics, rhetoric, music, science, mathematics, but above all else, it was Homer's Iliad that entranced the young prince, the epic tale of Achilles' wrath. When Alexander was still a boy, a horse trader presented a hot-blooded stallion to Philip's court. It was a magnificent animal, its coat a shining black with a white mark like a star upon its head. None of the fine horsemen of Macedon could tame the beast. Until, that is, the boy Alexander realized that the horse was afraid of its own shadow and turned it towards the sun. Alexander named the steed Bucephalus, and from that day forth the two were bonded like brothers. Now sat proudly astride his mount, Alexander accompanied his victorious father on the road home to Macedon, through the rocky territory of the Triballi. It was to prove an eventful journey. On campaign with his father, Alexander had finally been given the chance to prove himself. Things were not always so harmonious between father and son. Alexander's fiercely protective mother Olympias was not Philip's only wife, nor was she a full-blooded Macedonian. At the wedding feast for Philip's seventh wife, the girl's father proposed a toast.
May the gods bless this union, and may it produce a legitimate Macedonian heir.
And what am I then? A bastard?
Philip rose, drew his sword, and advanced. Not on the man who had insulted his son, but against Alexander. Thoroughly drunk, the one-eyed conqueror tripped and fell flat on his face.
Here is the man who would lead you from Europe into Asia, and he can't even cross from one couch to the next!
Yet for every quarrel, there was a reconciliation. And Alexander once again rode at his father's side as Philip bore down on Greece. Philip had long wished to be master of the Greek world, and the wily campaigner had used all manner of diplomatic tricks to extend his influence to the south. For years, an uneasy peace abided. But now, the Greeks prepared to make one last stand against their would-be conqueror. Astride the road to Chaeronea, the Greek forces waited. On their right, the Athenians, their empire long diminished but their pride irrepressible. On their left, the Thebans, among their ranks the elite Sacred Band. From the north, their long pikes swaying above storms of dust, came the Macedonians. And on their flank, with full command of the king's finest cavalry, was Alexander. At Chaeronea, amid the bodies skewered by pikes and mangled by swords, the city-states of Greece had their hopes of independence trampled into the mud. Philip could finally turn his gaze eastwards, to his long-held ambition of plundering the rich Persian Empire. His hopes, however, were suddenly and brutally snuffed out. An assassin's blade, jammed fiercely between Philip's ribs. The Lion of Macedon bled out in the dust, a fate he had brought upon so many others. And so it came to pass that Alexander, merely 20 summers of age, ascended to the throne of Macedon. The nobles swore him fealty, some gladly, some reluctantly, some out of duty and some out of calculation. Some were never given the choice, struck down on the new king's orders before they could cause trouble. Assassination, you see, was something of a staple of Macedonian politics. Equally routine was the propensity of Macedon's northern neighbors to invade whenever a king died, like jackals converging on a fresh carcass when a lion has moved away. The gleaming diadem of royalty set freshly upon his brow, Alexander marched north, where the first true test of his reign awaited. Not all of the northern tribes were foolish enough to pick a fight with Alexander. Like a keen-eyed jeweler, able to discern the potential in a rough and unshaped stone, King Langaros of the Agrianians chose to ingratiate himself with the Macedonian monarch. Langaros informed Alexander that a tribe known as the Autariatai were planning to attack the Macedonians, and even more helpfully, Langaros offered to deal with them himself. Alexander gladly accepted. And so, from every hamlet and township in the Strymon Valley, Langaros called upon his forces. Swift peltasts, clutching their throwing spears tight, cavalrymen atop hardy horses well used to cantering through rocky hills, stout infantrymen armed with that wicked long blade, the Rhomphaia. To ensure their commitment, Langaros spoke to them of duty. To bolster their fortitude, he invoked the gods. But to strengthen their zeal, Langaros promised them plunder. While Alexander had been away in the north, making friends and slaughtering foes, rumors were spreading in Greece.
I have it on good authority that the tyrant Alexander is dead, and with him that feckless rabble that his barbarous father called an army. Now is the time to rise up, cast out the garrisons that he imposed on your 5 cities, and retake your liberty!
Alexander was not dead. And when he heard that the Thebans had trapped their Macedonian garrison on the city's Acropolis, he was furious. Ah, Thebes. The city where Oedipus had plucked out his own eyes, where Antigone hanged herself, where Heracles went mad and slew his own family. For defying Alexander, the Thebans would suffer a new tragedy. Alexander's destruction of Thebes was near total. All that he allowed to remain were the temples, the ancient Cadmea, and the house of the poet Pindar. The rest of the rebellious Greeks immediately surrendered, and Alexander could once again turn his gaze towards Persia. As was only natural before such a grand expedition, Alexander went to Delphi, seeking the wisdom of the god Apollo. When Alexander arrived, he was told that Apollo's priestess was absent from the temple, this being a day when prophecies were forbidden. But Alexander, believing that his will surpassed any sacred rules, marched to the priestess's quarters and began to drag her towards the temple, determined that she would tell him his fate My son! Exclaimed the terrified priestess. You are unconquerable! Satisfied with his boorishly acquired prophecy, Alexander crossed the Hellespont. Parmenion was waiting with the advance guard, but Alexander had more pressing matters. He proceeded to Troy, where he anointed the gravestone of Achilles with oil. He and his friends ran races around the tomb as though they were the heroes of Homer's Iliad. The Persians had time for no such frivolities. They assembled their forces at the river Granicus, trusting in its steep banks and fast-flowing waters to deter Alexander's onslaught. Alexander gazed at the army arrayed against him, a host more numerous than any he had yet faced. The steeds of the Persian nobles strutting along the serried ranks, their riders eagerly watching for a glimpse of the invader they wished to slay. Upon a single charge across the Granicus, Alexander would stake the fate of his entire expedition. Like the kings of Homer's Iliad, vying for glory in the foremost ranks, Macedonian monarchs led from the front, and few with such zeal as Alexander. At the Granicus he plunged into the fray, as a famished wolf darts among a grazing flock, tearing at sheep and shepherd alike. But Alexander ventured too far, and a Persian horseman brought his sword swinging towards the king's neck. But Clytus, lurching forward, sliced the Persian's arm from his shoulder. His first victory over the Mede in hand, and feeling just as invincible as the Pythian priestess had proclaimed him, Alexander marched on. His target was the coastal city of Halicarnassus, its grand harbor ringed by walls flecked with sea foam, where the great warrior queen Artemisia had once ruled. You see, Alexander had a rather unconventional plan to deal with the Persian navy. Rather than build a fleet and fight them at sea, he'd simply use his army to capture the Persian naval bases, one by one. The rightful queen of Halicarnassus was Ada II, a wise and learned woman, and a gracious benefactor of the temple at Delphi. But, deposed by her brother, Ada now languished in exile, until the arrival of Alexander presented her with an opportunity. The exiled queen welcomed Alexander, putting her wealth, her followers, and her considerable knowledge at his disposal. So splendidly did they get along, Ada even adopted Alexander as her own son. The siege of Halicarnassus, then, would be a family affair. Breaching Halicarnassus was a tremendous feat, as had been the victory at the Granicus, not to mention the slew of cities throughout Asia Minor that had surrendered without a fight. Yet the victory Alexander truly craved remained elusive. He set off once more, seeking a confrontation with the Persian king Darius III, named after the very monarch who had launched the first Persian invasion of Greece. Along the way, Alexander came upon the town of Gordion. Here, there was an ancient cart tied to a post by the most fiendishly intricate knot, a tangled mass of ancient cords twisting, snaking, weaving, slipping over and under and around a knot with no visible beginning or end. Not a very interesting attraction, you might think, but it was said that whoever could undo the knot would rule the world. Alexander examined the knot, paused for thought. Then with a single stroke of his sword, simply sliced it in two. From there, Alexander proceeded south, until he reached Cilicia. He began to feel a frightful heat rising in his breast. Then he broke into a wild sweat, frothing like a raging stallion. He flung himself into the icy cold waters of the river Kidnus, but emerged racked with cramps and fever. All of the king's physicians feared to administer a remedy. What dreadful tortures would await them if they failed, or worsened the king's condition? Only one, Philip of Acarnania, was willing to produce a cure. But as Alexander was about to raise the potion to his lips, a messenger passed him a letter from Parmenion, claiming that the Persian king had paid the doctor to poison him. Alexander looked the physician straight in the eye and downed the cup in one go. At first, the king fell back, his breath lost, swooning into near unconsciousness. But then, as Philip attended to him, Alexander regained his senses and felt the cure work its way through his body. A period of rest was clearly in order. Alexander and his men, welcomed into the cities of Lower Cilicia, at last paused their relentless march. So confident was Darius that he would triumph at Issus, he had brought his mother, wife, and daughters to the battle. So hastily did he flee, they were left behind for Alexander to capture. Like the women of Troy, powerless before their captors, Darius' family wept and lamented, imagining that their lot would now be misery and servitude. But Alexander treated them with perfect respect, and allowed them every comfort to which they were accustomed. Alexander proceeded along the coast until he came to Tyre, that great city of the Phoenicians, set upon an offshore island as though the whole marvelous edifice floated on the sea. Alexander demanded entry to Tyre, wishing to sacrifice at the temple of Melkart. The Tyrians refused. And when Alexander sent messengers a second time, they were hurled into the sea from the city walls. An outrageous thing to do. But the Tyrians, their grand fortifications protected by the waves that lapped up against them, held the entirely reasonable expectation that Alexander would give up and move on. Alexander rarely did what you and I might consider reasonable. And so, work began on a vast causeway, a bridge of earth and rubble between Tyre and the mainland. The world reshaped at Alexander's command. The Tyrians paid an awful price for defying Alexander. Thousands were slaughtered in the city. Thousands more crucified along the beach. The rest sold into slavery, condemned like the women of Troy to know ever after that once they had ruled a great city by the shore. In Egypt, Alexander received a more favorable reception. The Egyptians had always chafed under Persian rule, and so when Alexander arrived, they hailed him as a liberator. They proclaimed him Pharaoh, the incarnation of Ra. And Alexander blessed his new subjects with a magnificent city, Alexandria, crowning the rich Nile Valley. Having seized the jewel of Darius' empire, Alexander turned once more to defeating his rival in battle. Darius sent messenger after messenger, desperately suing for peace.
30,000 talents of silver. All the territory west of the Euphrates. Co-rulership of the Achaemenid Empire.
If I were you, I would accept.
So would I, if I were Parmenion.
His final offer rejected, Darius gathered an army once more. They awaited Alexander at Gaugamela, arrayed in their thousands upon a grim and dusty plain. The great king ordered the place cleared of any vegetation, so that his vicious scythed chariots would have no obstacle between them and their prey. On the eve of battle, beneath the indifferent stars, the armies of Darius and Alexander slept fitfully, knowing that on the morrow they would decide the fate of empires. Alexander was determined that Darius would not get away from him a second time. Over jagged hills and shifting dunes, Alexander chased the great king, urging his swift riders on through freezing desert nights and days cruelly elongated by the summer sun. But when Alexander finally caught up with his foe, Darius lay dying. In the dirt, amidst upturned wagons and mules broken from exhaustion, the great king of Persia bled out, murdered by his own men. Alexander had Darius's body cleaned and dressed, and returned to his mother. And so, a mere 5 years after he inherited the crown of Macedon, Alexander seized the diadem of Persia, a king of kings, to be sure. The killers of Darius he hunted down. The cities that resisted his rule he stormed. But in truth, most of the Persian governing class willingly exchanged one king for another. Power such as Alexander now possessed is rarely left untroubled. Alexander caught word of a plot to kill him, hatched within his own court. The would-be assassins were rounded up and executed. Among them, Philotas, son of Parmenion. Philotas had known of the conspiracy, but said nothing. A crime, Alexander declared, as heinous as the plot itself. But what of Parmenion? The moment he learned that his son had been executed, he would be sure to act. And he had thousands of loyal men beneath him. No, he too would have to die.
Armed and belted men in my tent. So, he's finally decided to do away with me.
Will you resist, sir?
No, I won't. But tell the boy king this: the gods cannot abide excess.
Alexander founded many cities that bore his name. This one he named Alexandria Escate, meaning the furthest. Here, on the edge of the known world, beset by foes and vexed by the barren landscape, Alexander raised his improbable city, an attestation that every last parasang of the Persian Empire was his to order. Yet beyond the borders of the empire he had just conquered, there were lands vaster and richer than even the sprawling Persian realm. India, a place little understood by the Greeks, who traded tales of a land where giant ants dug for gold in the rich hillsides, where rivers of honey flowed from rocks, where men lived 100 or even 200 years, untroubled by pains. They spoke of men with one giant foot, with which they sheltered themselves from the sun, men with the heads of dogs, and men with no heads at all, who had their faces in their chests. I shall let you decide the veracity of these stories for yourself. In one respect, though, the land of the 5 rivers was much like anywhere else. It was endlessly contested by rival kings. On one side of the river Hydaspes lay the realm of Takshila, ruled by the young king Ambi, who had recently gained the throne after his father was murdered. On the other side of the Hydaspes, another king ruled. Horus, the man who had recently murdered Ambi's father. This being as good a pretext as any for another round of fighting, the two kings gathered their armies, made extravagant promises to their mercenaries, and prepared to wage war. Back at the court of Alexander, things grew fractious. Now that he was king of Persia, Alexander was beginning to adopt Persian customs, including the practice of prostration before the king. To many of Alexander's Greek and Macedonian followers, this gesture seemed not only servile, but blasphemous, an honor reserved solely for the gods. At a banquet, Clytus, ever the straight-talker, confronted the king. Both men were deeply drunk.
What is this, Alexander? You dress in foreign finery. You consult with eunuchs and magi. If a Macedonian wants an audience with you, he has to beg it from some pompous Persian courtier, and then prostrate himself like a slave. Have you forsaken your own kinsman?
Shut your wretched mouth, Clytus. If it weren't for me, you'd be fending off Thracian goat thieves from some hillside hovel.
No! If it weren't for your father, you'd have no army, no victories, no glory. Without your father, you would be nothing. And if he could see you now, he'd be ashamed.
Alexander wrenched a spear from a nearby guard, hurled it across the room, and struck Clytus dead. Alexander looked upon the lifeless face of the man he had once called friend, the man who had saved his life at the Chronicles. And Alexander wept. All through the night, all through the following day, his grief tortured him. A procession of friends and comrades, courtiers and flatterers, philosophers and wise men came to him, trying to soothe his guilty soul. But what roused him from his melancholy was a force greater, deeper than any grief: his yearning. India awaited. A chance not just for conquest, but to follow in the footsteps of the god Dionysus, to witness marvels unseen by any Greek, to reach the outer sea that girdled the earth itself. Unlike Darius, Porus did not flee. He fought on, even as his army routed and his elephants were dragged shrieking to the ground. At last, worn out by wounds, Porus was captured and brought before his foe.
Tell me, how do you wish to be treated?
Like a king.
Admiring Porus's strength and nobility, Alexander not only spared him, he made him the latest satrap of his ever-expanding empire. Alexander gained one friend that day, but he lost another.
His wounds were too great, my lord.
No. He has overcome worse than this.
We all have our limits, sire.
As ever, there was only one thing that could assuage Alexander's troubled soul: action. His new ally, Porus, was quick to suggest a suitable target for Alexander's next conquest: his own enemies, a warlike tribe known as the Cathaeans. And so the Macedonians prepared to march again. It had been 8 years since they set out from home. They had won innumerable battles, founded cities, plundered more wealth than any man would know what to do with. Yet still they were driven on by their insatiable king. And so the men began to wonder, would they ever return home to enjoy their spoils and sire children to hear their stories? Or would Alexander push them on until they collapsed?
I have heard rumors, men, that your conviction is faltering. That some among you wish to turn back and leave our conquest incomplete. Do you not know what lies beyond this river? Lands lusher than you have ever seen. Riches that Croesus would envy. Glory, oh what glory, to rival Heracles himself. Silence. Speak, someone, I am no tyrant.
We love you, Alexander. Truly we do. But we want to go home.
East is the Ganges, which empties into the great sea that girdles the earth and will bear us back to Macedon. East is the way, east we shall go.
But still the silence persisted. The men refused to go on. Like Achilles sulking at Troy, Alexander withdrew to his tent. For 2 days he spoke to no one, his heart filled with terrible rage. Armies are fickle. Perhaps the men would reconsider their refusal, whether from shame, or fear, or duty. Or perhaps the gods who had shown Alexander such favor would send a sign that none could ignore. No such portent came, nor did the army's grief turn to compliance. And so Alexander at last agreed to take them home. But, as you might expect, he wasn't simply going to take them back the way they came. They would build ships, sail down the Hydaspes until it joined with the river Indus, and then onto the sea. Any who stood in their path they would conquer, filling the glittering river with bloated corpses.
Alexander! Alexander! The arrow is stuck in his lung! Fetch the physician!
No, Perdiccas! Cut it out of me! Now, man!
Alexander's body was by now as scarred and slashed as a butcher's block, and this new wound was the deepest yet. Perhaps, having escaped death once again, he ought to have considered a reduction in his adventuring. On the contrary, it only reinforced his sense of invincibility. When he reached the southern coast, Alexander announced that the bulk of his army would not be sailing home. Rather, they would trek through the vast Gedrosian desert. The fleet was put under the command of Niarchos, with orders to sail along the coast and rendezvous at Babylon. And so the admiral made ready. The ships were loaded with barley cakes and wineskins, nets and fishing lines, chests of gold, should there be opportunities for trade, and racks of spears, should they need to fight. In addition to the steersmen and sailors, the carpenters and soldiers, there were also geographers, botanists, and naturalists, eagerly crowding the decks for a sight of something new and marvelous. For this, you see, would be a voyage of discovery. Alexander's march through the desert had taken a terrible toll. The sands had swallowed countless men, their strength sapped by disease or thirst or long festering wounds. Why confront the desert? To claim the glory of overcoming it? Or to punish the army that had refused to indulge his ambitions? Only the gods know now. And there were graver losses yet to come.
Not you, Hephaestion. Anyone but you.
I would have followed you to the ends of the earth, Alexander.
As Achilles grieved for Patroclus, so Alexander grieved for Hephaestion. An epic anguish, biting sorrow mingled with thundering rage. Like a storm cloud, gathering up its fierce energy as it rolls across the darkening sky, Alexander convulsed with wrath that demanded release. His black gaze fell upon the Chasseans, who dwelt among the craggy mountains of the Zagros. In baneful silence, the great conqueror led his men into the hills for the final time. Like Heracles, driven mad by Hera's hand, Alexander slaughtered the Chasseans without pity, soaking the hills crimson. And then, sated, he was alone once more. Hephaestion, Clytus, Bucephalus, Parmenion, they had all crossed the Styx. And how many brave men besides? How many soldiers had left Macedon as keen-eyed youths, only to heave their last breaths on some distant, desolate plain? At last Alexander, who had seen so much death, confronted it himself. Some spoke of disease, others of poison. Perhaps the many wounds finally wore him down, or the drink, or the grief. Even the greatest have their limits.
You must choose a successor, Alexander. To whom will the kingdom pass?
To the strongest.
And with that, the mighty heart stilled. Bereft, filled with sorrow and regret, his dreams of world conquest thwarted, the blazing star burnt out. But how brightly it had shone. He was too much for this world. Too spirited, too ambitious, too bold. Should he really be faulted for that? As for the empire he forged, well, as you might expect, bequeathing your realm to the strongest is hardly conducive to a smooth transition of power. Alexander's generals immediately set to fighting one another, pulling the empire apart like stray dogs tearing at a hunk of meat. No empire would ever be so rapidly gained or so suddenly shattered. Let me rest my tired voice now, and then I shall tell you of another empire, one that rose slowly, patiently, relentlessly, and endured.
As you are growing your civilization, it's important to begin in the right manner. A thriving early economy will allow you to reach the feudal age in a strong position, from which you can continue to grow and ably battle your opponent. We'll start off with gathering food from our sheep. It is important to note that all animals decay while you harvest food from them. Make sure not to kill all your animals at once. We will focus all of our villagers on a single sheep, and once they are done harvesting meat, move them all together to the next one. This minimizes the food decay. When gathering resources, it is important not to lose too much time walking to the nearest gather point. Make sure to place your mills, lumber camps, mining camps, and town centers close to resources. You can also queue up multiple tasks for your villagers by holding down the Shift key when assigning tasks. This is a new feature in the Definitive Edition. The last lesson is a dangerous one, so pay attention. Boars are very difficult to hunt. They are far away and fight back fiercely when you attack them. However, it is possible to lure a boar to your town center and kill it safely. Before we do this, we may want to research loom in the town center, as it makes our villagers stronger. Next, select one villager. Then right-click on a nearby boar to go hunt it. Watch closely as the villager shoots it twice. Now that the boar is properly aggravated and is charging at the villager, task your villager to run back to the safety of your town center. Once the boar is close to the town center, have other nearby villagers shoot the boar to kill it. Excellent! Dinner is served. One of the most common strategies in multiplayer games is the Fast Castle Age strategy. Today, you will learn to execute a particular build order for this. A build order is a set of instructions to be strictly followed in order to guarantee the most efficient gameplay. They are quite common in multiplayer games, so research them in your free time. First of all, it is very important to never leave your town center idle. Check your town center regularly to see if a villager is being trained. If not, use the Go to Town Center hotkey to jump to your town center and click the Create Villager button to train or queue up another villager. If you do not have enough food, force your villagers gathering food to drop off their resources. Use the rally flag in your town center to task it to send new villagers to a resource or construction site when they are trained or ungarrisoned. When villagers are newly created or when they complete a task, they can go idle. Keep an eye on the idle indicator on your top panel. Click on it or use the Idle Villager hotkey to cycle between idle villagers and send them back to work. Remember, build orders are a great way to improve your play, but do not forget to strategize. No single game is the same, so you will often need to think outside of the box. Good luck. Booming is a common strategy for team games, especially on easily defensible maps such as Black Forest or Arena. It means building a strong economy before producing a powerful military. Booming makes you vulnerable until you reach the Imperial Age, but if executed properly, this strategy will allow you to overwhelm your enemies with large armies. The key to booming is ensuring constant production of villagers. Ideally, about half of your total population room should be villagers. To achieve this, you must build multiple town centers and ensure that they are always training new villagers. This requires a large amount of resources, especially food and wood, so finding the right balance will be important. You can also improve the resource gathering rate of your villagers by researching economic technologies at the town center, lumber camp, mill, and mining camp. These technologies are important, so do not ignore them. Apply these lessons and your empire will thrive. Early attacks, also called rushes, are often a cat-and-mouse game. You can harass the enemy economy by sending military units to attack enemy villagers. If the villagers fight back, or if enemy soldiers arrive, your raiders should retreat and seek better opportunities. Try to pick off any weak or separated villager instead of going for large groups. That way, you will do the most damage while sustaining the least losses. Do not chase villagers when they are too close to their town center. You will risk losing several units to the arrows that it shoots. Keep an eye on your own economy while you attack the enemy. You must keep collecting more resources and training villagers so you can continue to train new soldiers, upgrade your military, and finally advance to the next age yourself. The best of luck to you. The enemy player will usually not stand idle while you build your empire. Learning how to maintain growth while under pressure from enemy attacks is vital to your empire's survival. As you can see, your base is surrounded by impassable objects such as trees, mines, and forage bushes. These will act as a natural barrier between your units and those of the enemy. However, in between them are gaps through which the enemy can advance. To defend your base, you will have to use your villagers to build walls, gates, and buildings to close these gaps. Like this. When the enemy sends in their military units, your top priority is to protect your villagers. Ringing the bell of your town center is an option, but it will paralyze your economy. Instead, just garrison the villagers that are in immediate danger. A watchtower offers both protection for your villagers and defense for your base. Make sure enemy units cannot position themselves within one tile of your tower, however. Your towers cannot shoot at units adjacent to them until you research murder holes in the Castle Age. Pre-Castle Age units like militia, men-at-arms, spearmen, scout cavalry, archers, and skirmishers are not strong enough to destroy a base on their own. Instead, they are used to harass and kill enemy villagers to damage the enemy economy. During such an early rush, it is possible to fight back. If you have more villagers than the enemy has military units, or if you have military units of your own, use them to fight the invaders. Just make sure that you do not lose any villagers. That would harm you more than keeping them garrisoned. Focus on the enemy units with low hit points first. Villagers do not fight automatically, so you must manage them carefully. I hear the enemy approaching. Take up arms and fend off their attack. In this challenge, you will learn advanced tactics which will help you gain the upper hand on your opponents. First of all, always try to use your units according to their strengths and weaknesses. I will explain the standard unit types. If you want to learn more about other units, consult the technology tree. Archers are strong against infantry, but weak against skirmishers. Spearmen are strong against scout cavalry, but are not of much use against men-at-arms and archers. Skirmishers have a bonus attack against archers and spearmen, but lose out against all other kinds of military units. Men-at-arms are especially good against buildings. However, they also fare well against other units unless they are outnumbered. Scout cavalry are strong against skirmishers, but will also fare well against small groups of archers and are excellent raiders to boot. When commanding ranged units, your best chance when facing a numerically superior force is to use hit-and-run tactics. Use your archers to shoot at the enemy units. Then run away when they get too close. Take note of the surrounding terrain. If you fight downhill or from behind a cliff, your units will do additional damage to enemy units. If you fight in a narrow passage, a smaller group of units can overcome a larger one by exploiting the bottleneck. Now that you have learned these important lessons, let us see how you fare on the battlefield. Groups of soldiers have 4 different battle formations: line, box, staggered, and flank formation. Line formation is the standard battle formation. It densely packs your units, making them fight well against other units. Flank formation divides your army, sending one half to one side and the other half to the other side. This is useful for avoiding projectiles, like those from mangonels and bombard cannons. With staggered formation, your units spread out. This makes them less vulnerable to area damage or to scorpion missiles, which pass through units. Box formation is designed to protect vulnerable units in the center by surrounding them with stronger units. However, this is not used as much in online games, as it spreads out the group and makes the units on the outside easier targets. To manage large groups of different unit types, it is always a good idea to use control groups. This helps you to quickly select and move them around on the battlefield. To create a control group, select a group of units and simultaneously press Control and one of the number keys, 1 through 9. Then, to select a control group, press the same number. You can have up to 10 groups at the same time. With this knowledge, you should be able to maneuver your army around more easily. Go ahead and practice it in the next challenge. There are 3 main types of warships available for use against your opponents. Galleys equipped to fire from a distance, fire ships for close combat, and exploding demolition ships. Each of these warships has its own strengths and weaknesses. The war galley fires bolts from a long distance, but the fast, maneuverable fire ship with its high pierce armor is an excellent counter to it. Demolition ships, on the other hand, are fast and very effective at clearing out groups of enemy ships in one devastating explosion. They do especially well against groups of fire ships. However, if the approaching demolition ships are targeted by war galleys, they will be sunk before they can get close enough to cause any damage. Using the 3 ship types efficiently requires some practice. Hoist the sails and prove your mettle. Sometimes it is crucial to overcome your opponent early on. This is especially the case if the civilization matchup and map favor your opponent during the late stages of the game. In this challenge, you will learn how to quickly destroy an enemy castle. As soon as you reach the castle age and build a siege workshop, you can construct 4 different types of siege weapons. To destroy a castle, you will only need battering rams. These are best equipped to smash fortifications due to their high pierce armor and attack bonus against buildings. Garrison units inside of the rams to make the rams move faster and to increase their attack against buildings. Once you reach the Imperial Age, the trebuchet will become available at your castle. It is in many ways the most powerful siege weapon in the game. but it needs to pack and unpack when reloading to fire at enemy buildings. The bombard cannon does not have that problem, but it has lower attack and range than the trebuchet. Bombard cannons are also effective against units. However, you must first research chemistry at the university before you may produce them. If you decide to attack enemy fortifications, make sure that you have enough soldiers to defend your siege units. Unprotected siege weapons are quite vulnerable. Additionally, research the armor and attack upgrades at your blacksmith, so that your soldiers stand a better chance against enemy defenders. Enough talk. Let's tear down a castle.